Tom King and Mitch Gerads' 2017 Mr. Miracle series is one of the most fascinating and unique comic books I've read in recent years. Throughout 12 issues, the duo reinvent the classic hero, taking the original premise outlined in 1971, a new god who can escape from any trap, and use it to examine the impact of childhood trauma and PTSD on someone whose life has been defined by trying to break free, but never truly escaping the past. The book follows Scott's attempt to find peace in the life that he and Big Barda have created on Earth, where he's an international celebrity and arguably the greatest escape artist of all time. Despite this success though, Scott is haunted by the trauma of his childhood raised on Apocalypse, always fearing that the past he fled will one day catch up to him. This fear becomes reality in the first issue of the series, where Darkseid has murdered Highfather and reignited the war between Apocalypse and New Genesis, ultimately forcing Mr. Miracle to choose whether to flee and escape once again, or finally face his trauma and attempt to overcome it. While this series is clearly an exploration of mental health and trauma, themes that writer Tom King has analysed throughout much of the work, Mr. Miracle is also a deeply personal tribute to the hero's creator, Jack Kirby. As mentioned previously, when the character was first created, Mr. Miracle was a symbol for Kirby's own fears of confinement in his career. With the Fourth World books he went to DC to publish, serving as his attempt to break free and finally tell stories that were unquestionably his singular vision. King and Gerads used the setup of Scott free, being forced to confront the world he escaped from, to comment on Kirby's career and his legacy, particularly the ways in which the Fourth World comic books influenced the entire superhero genre. The notion of combining a love letter to Jack Kirby with an exploration on PTSD and mental health may sound like two entirely distinct themes at first, but for Tom King, any attempt at telling a modern Mr. Miracle story would have always resulted in Kirby's presence being all over it. As King explains,
"When I read the Fourth World stuff, to me it reads like an incredibly personal work. It reads to me as a guy who'd been through war and come back from it. It reads to me as a guy who'd achieved his greatest dream in life, which was to become this sort of comic creator for his family, and then lost it, and was trying to recover it when he moved from Marvel to DC. It's known that he originally developed the Fourth World for Marvel as this kind of Asgardian world, then he brought it over to DC when he felt disrespected how Marvel treated him. To me, when I read it, I see all of that mixed up. All that anger at Stan Lee, Marvel, all of that combined with a guy who grew up in the Jewish ghettos of the Lower East Side and had to scrap for everything he ever had, and fought his way through World War II. To me, it reads as an entirely personal work."
With this in mind, it's clear that Mr. Miracle's journey to overcome his trauma and find happiness in the life that he and Barda have created on Earth, as well as the constant fear of his past catching up to him, is designed to parallel Kirby's own anxieties at the time of Mr. Miracle's first publication. This sense of entrapment that Scott and Jack both share is represented in a number of different ways throughout the series. Namely, as Scott attempts to raise a family on Earth, he's haunted by the looming figure of Darkseid, the comic's primary villain, with the phrase "Darkseid is" frequently glitching onto the pages, with Scott constantly fearing that he will one day have to face his adopted father once again. It's worth noting that Darkseid is not only a character created by Kirby, but they're a villain whose motivation primarily exists to eradicate free will, the very thing Kirby sought for so much of his career. Likewise, Gerads' near exclusive use of a 9-panel grid throughout the book also contributes to this feeling of confinement, with the rigid layout beginning to resemble bars on a prison cell the longer the story progresses. But this link between Kirby and Scott Free isn't just evident in their fears of confinement, as throughout Mr. Miracle, King attempts to offer some form of peace and closure to the hero, and by extension offers a fitting send-off to his iconic creator. This is best demonstrated by issue 5 of the series. You see, in the previous issue, Orion had travelled to Earth to seek Scott's help in the war against Darkseid, only for him to believe that Scott's apprehension was due to him secretly working with his adopted father, and as a result, Mr. Miracle was sentenced to death. Issue 5 serves as Scott and Barda's final day together before his execution. The couple spend the day in Los Angeles visiting the Chinese theatre, where they place their hands upon the various handprints scattered throughout the pavement. Scott, still mourning the loss of his father and fearing that his pending execution is something even he can't escape from, finds himself placing his hands against those of Jack Kirby. Over the course of a single page, this moment encapsulates so much of what this entire comic book series is about. Throughout the story, Scott struggles with his past and the expectations set by his godlike fathers, seeking to simply live a happy life with his wife on Earth, but finds himself being dragged back into the fight he once escaped from. This fear is demonstrated perfectly by Scott reaching out to place his hands inside of Kirby's, only for his hands to be just too small to fit inside of his creators. I think it's worth noting that in real life, Kirby doesn't actually have his handprints outside of the historic cinema, though his frequent collaborator Stan Lee does. As such, it's unsurprising that Scott and Barda's day together would be interrupted by Funky Flashman, the character Kirby created to parody Lee in the original Mr. Miracle comics. Although Scott's arc in this story is designed to pay respect to Kirby's own experiences at the time he first wrote the character, Jack himself is actually represented by two other characters. The first one is Oberon, Mr. Miracle's longtime manager and father figure, who's revealed to have died sometime prior to the first issue. Scott and Barda visit his grave later in issue 5, where we learn Oberon's surname was actually Kurtzberg, the real surname of Jack Kirby. Now, Oberon's death is not only designed to parallel Highfather's, with Scott now having lost both his biological father and the man who was arguably more of a father figure to him than anyone else, it also allows King to explore how his memory affects Scott throughout the story, and by extension, how the legacy of Jack Kirby himself affects those that he touched. The other character King uses to discuss Kirby's legacy, though, is to me far more unique and fascinating, as in issue 7, Barda gives birth to her and Scott's first son, who they name Jacob. Jacob, also the birth name of Jack Kirby, symbolises hope throughout this series, being the family that will help Scott overcome his demons. But it's actually in his relationship with Funky Flashman that King attempts to provide closure between Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. You see, not long after Jacob's birth, both Mr. Miracle and Big Barda are forced to return to New Genesis and lead the fight against Darkseid, causing the couple to ask Funky to watch over their son. As such, while Scott is forced to confront his fears head on and stand against Darkseid, we see Jacob and Funky playing with action figures and creating imaginary stories together. In issue 10, for example, after Scott returns home, Funky tells him a story that he and Jacob created, describing an epic tale of a star-eating god and his helper, a reference to Galactus and the Silver Surfer, whose solo comic was a major catalyst in Kirby's move to DC. However, while Scott quizzes Funky on whose idea this story really was, Flashman insists that it was Jack who provided the imagination, and all he did was simply add the words. In a way, the relationship between Funky and Jacob is Tom King's attempt to provide a friendly sense of closure to Lee and Kirby's often contentious relationship. In the very last issue, when Scott returns home to find Funky once again playing with Jacob, Funky tells him that Jack and I have nothing to reproach ourselves about. Now, this simple line might actually be one of the most heartfelt moments in this entire 12-issue series, as it references the very last conversation Stan and Jack ever had before the latter's passing in 1994. As Lee himself explained in a 2014 interview,
I tell you, the last thing Jack Kirby said to me was very strange. I met him at a comic book convention right before the end. He wasn't that well. He walked over and said, "Stan, you have nothing to reproach yourself about." He knew people were saying things about me and wanted to let me know that I hadn't done anything wrong in his eyes. I think he realized it. Then, he walked away.
This sense of reconciliation between the two legendary creators serves as a touching send-off to each of them, with their respective legacies in the comic book industry, both together and apart, being celebrated in this comic. Likewise, Scott Free receives an equally fitting send-off in the final issue of Mr. Miracle. You see, in issue 11, Scott, now holding the title of Highfather after Orion's death, travels with Barda and Jacob to Apocalypse to finally confront Darkseid, who tells them that he will stop his invasion of New Genesis if they hand over their grandson to him. Initially, it seems as if the couple might actually hand Jacob over to the villain, before Scott stabs Darkseid with a Farron knife, a weapon made from the flesh of Orion with the ability to burn a new god from the inside, and kills him. With Darkseid now dead and the war over, the final issue sees the family return home, where Barda gives birth to their second child, a girl named Rosalind, who shares her name with the wife of Jack Kirby. Seemingly, Scott's fear of his past coming back to haunt him exists no more, but it's once he returns to Earth that he's met by the ghosts of everyone who has died throughout this story: Orion, Granny Goodness, Darkseid, and even Oberon. The comic begins to make the reader speculate as to whether or not Scott is truly alive. However, the question of whether or not the comic's happy ending is real is never fully resolved, as King's primary focus in these closing moments isn't to expose Scott's fate, but instead to demonstrate his growth and journey throughout the events of this book. As Scott speaks with the ghost of Oberon, he does begin to question his reality, wondering if the life he's found with Barda and their two children is too good to be true, only for his longtime mentor to tell him what truly matters is the family and the purpose he found throughout his journey. Taking inspiration from the infamous Kirby quote, Oberon tells Scott that while life may still break his heart, there's someone out there who'll help him put it back together. The final moments of this series see an emotional goodbye between Scott and Oberon, as the hero embraces Barda in front of an illustration of Kirby's final issue of Mr. Miracle. With the King of Comics proudly watching on from above, Barda tells Scott that Darkseid is, but we are too, and that despite whatever anxieties and problems we may face, as long as there is hope somewhere deep inside of you, there's always a reason to persevere, and there's always a reason to keep fighting for the happy ending that you deserve.